All right, class, we had left off with talking about the crash of 1929 and Hoover's first response of really rejecting direct relief, believing any sort of welfare could undermine Americans' moral character, and the whole idea of rugged individualism. Um, he rejected any program that smacked of socialism. This is going to include something called the Muscle Shoals Bill. This would have dammed up the Tennessee River and provided electricity to the region. But he refused on the grounds that the government would then be selling power in competition with private companies. Keep this in mind because when we talk about FDR and the New Deal, this is a lot like the Tennessee Valley Authority that's created there. Um, we had talked about how Hoover urged Americans to turn to community and church resources. Go to the Salvation Army, go to the Red Cross to meet the needs of the poor. And he also urged state and local authorities to take responsibility for assisting individuals. Why does he do this? Because on constitutional grounds, he felt that the government should confine its action to large general programs. Um, Gradually, though, it became pretty apparent that no entity except the federal government had the resources to address this profound suffering on a scale that's never been seen before of the Great Depression. And so, as local sources of assistance became exhausted, um, Hoover's humanitarian nature required him to seek out solutions in spite of almost universal advice from the economists that were in his circle to allow the economy to hit rock bottom and find its own way out of the crater. So what does Hoover do? Hoover, at first, this is kind of like that associationalism that we had talked about in a previous video. Hoover met with business and labor leaders, um, you know, working with them to try to avoid layoffs and strikes wherever possible. In addition, he signed something called the Norris LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act in 1932, outlawing businesses from making anti-union or what we call yellow dog contracts. This act also prevented federal courts from issuing injunctions. Injunctions are court orders that restrain strikes, boycotts, or picketing. Hoover is going to eventually approve federal financing of large work projects. This is where, we get the Boulder Dam and the Hoover Dam. I think are the two most famous ones. And this cost the government around $2.5 billion. Why does Hoover do this? This seems to be run counter to his belief. These projects could be justified because they both provided jobs and created structures of great value for the nation. 1932, Hoover takes probably the biggest step with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. This is to make $500 million in what we call pump priming loans to try to stimulate the economy in a trickle down manner. Most of this benefit went to large corporations, and unfortunately, little of that money actually trickled down to small businesses or individuals. Um, Even so, though, the RFC, the government projects like the Boulder and Hoover Dam, they represented a substantial departure from the conservative position of no assistance, and they became the prototype of to the New Deal programs that FDR is going to implement, during his administration. Hoover slowly shed much of his resistance to federal policies aimed at helping individuals, but the government was new to this kind of intervention. Um, and not surprisingly, some of his programs were ineffective, while some were actually counterproductive. One that was counterproductive is something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. Um, Hoover calls a special session of Congress to give farmers, or to try to give farmers, some tariff relief. I remember high tariffs, farmers don't like that. But the legislature actually allowed special interest groups to twist the original bill around into a monster that raised tariffs to 60% instead of lowering them to the former 38%. We had talked about, oh, foreign trade, world trade is going to break down. This is one of the reasons why. Foreign countries that could no longer compete in American markets start to react by raising tariffs on American goods. And so this resultant economic isolation further stifled businesses that were already limping into the Great Depression. Um, some other things that hurt Hoover is that he was hampered in his attempt to alleviate the nation's distress by an increasingly hostile Congress that was eager to really put the blame on him and divert it from themselves and from political parties. Hence, the most infamous name that's associated with Hoover would be Hoovervilles, those shanty towns that are starting to pop up in American cities. Midterm elections of 1930, the American people replaced many Republican congressmen and senators with liberals, and the House was controlled by Democrats. Um, Hoover is really going to be bitter about this. He believes that Congress is playing politics with human misery. But unfortunately for Hoover, it doesn't get any better. In fact, it gets worse. The final straw for Herbert Hoover is going to come in 1932 with the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army is a group of about 20,000 veterans who camped out in this makeshift shantytown in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 32 to lobby for immediate payment of their deferred insurance bonus. They were supposed to get a bonus in the 1940s. They're like, heck, we don't want the whole bonus for serving in World War One. Just give us a portion of it now, and we'll be out of your way. Congress is going to propose a bill discussing this program. Hoover's going to say, while this bill is in place or in session, you can set up your shanty towns. You can stay here. But as soon as Congress voted down that bill that would exceed it to to the demands of the Bonus Army, Hoover was left with the responsibility of disbanding the veterans. He managed to arrange transportation for around 6,000 of them, but the remainder were directed to leave on their own. When they refused, Hoover ordered the army to evict the veterans, and General Douglas MacArthur did so using bayonets, using tear gas, burning down tents, and you see the newspapers really take hold of this, especially when you have small children and infants being the victims of some of this, I guess you can say, unnecessary zeal of the U.S. Army and of indirectly of Herbert Hoover, and you just imagine the image that the newspapers are going to be able to paint that Big Bad Hoover is going to order the army to use force and use violence and use tear gas against former World War One soldiers, World War One veterans. This cannot be good for him, and so when we look at the upcoming 32 election, Hoover's going to run for re-election again, or run for re-election, excuse me. But anytime he made any sort of campaign appearances outside of Washington, he was booed, he was jeered. People poked fun at his overly optimistic campaign slogans, like "the worst is past," "prosperity is just around the corner." There's a political cartoon that's saying that, and his prosperity is just around the corner. And it has a picture of Herbert Hoover, and it has people jumping out of buildings and stuff, and he's just like, just not around this corner. He was also alarmed at some of these, what he saw was monumental and subversive changes suggested by the Democratic candidate Franklin Roosevelt. Hoover saw Roosevelt's New Deal for the Forgotten Man as seeking the destruction of capitalism, um, uh, socialism, but Roosevelt rejected both Hoover's conservatism and the radical advice of socialists and communists. Um, his aim here for this New Deal for the Forgotten Man is for a cautious liberalism, and he promised a balanced budget along with economic reforms. His campaign slogan, "Happy days are here again," um, seemed no less more overly optimistic than Herbert Hoover's, but perhaps it went down better with the voters since the Democratic Party platform also called for an end of prohibition, an increase in federal relief, including aid to individuals. The election was a landslide for the Democrats and for Franklin Roosevelt. FDR won about 57% of the popular vote, and the Democrats took control of both the Houses and the Senate. And the 32 election is key because you start to see the building of what's called the New Deal coalition. The New Deal coalition you'll see Southerners vote for Franklin Roosevelt. You'll see African Americans, which is something new, voting for a Democratic president, and you'll see Northern liberals, and you'll see labor voting for Franklin Roosevelt. And so this is going to be the beginnings of what we call the New Deal coalition. And during the meantime, between 32, at November 32 and March of 1933, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, they didn't talk to each other about, the transition that was going to happen between Hoover's administration and the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt refused to take part in anything until he got into office. He was quoted as saying, "It's not my baby," or "not my baby yet." And so if you look at Inauguration Day of 1933, you'll see here that FDR is smiling, waving to the crowds, while Herbert Hoover is stone cold, looking very, very, very down, angry, not happy. Put any adjective you want in there, and you can describe Herbert Hoover. In the next video, we will tackle FDR and the New Deal, starting with his 1933 inaugural address, with the most famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But there's more to that inaugural address that's both going to outline a plan for how FDR is going to deal with this Great Depression, and it's also going to cause some of his critics to raise a couple eyebrows as far as, well, what have we just done? How much power is this guy actually seeking out? What is this change going to be as far as government's responsibility for the general welfare of its citizenry? And so stay tuned for that video.